This is a discussion of the functional anatomy and histology of the endocrine glands. After outlining our objectives, we'll have a brief introduction to the endocrine system, talk about specific endocrine glands, looking at their gross anatomy and histology or microscopic anatomy, and finally, we'll look at some endocrine disorders. For your exam, you should be able to define the following terms: adenohypophysis, hormones, hypophysis, neurohypophysis, and tropic hormones. Additionally, you should be able to identify all major endocrine glands and tissues on an image, diagram, or model. You should be able to list the major hormones produced by each endocrine gland. And then finally, you should be able to recognize the histological structure of specific endocrine glands. The endocrine system is the second major control system of our body, and it acts in conjunction with our nervous system. The endocrine system produces a series of hormones that bind to specific receptors and cause a specific action. Some of our glands are mixed endocrine exocrine glands, and the hypothalamus is what we call a neuroendocrine gland because it combines the functions of the nervous system with the endocrine system in order to perform its functions. When we look at endocrine glands as a whole, we want to be able to identify these endocrine glands on a diagram. Superiorly, we have the pineal gland, which is located in the roof of the third ventricle. We have the hypothalamus, which is located anteriorly in the cerebrum. And hanging off of the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland. As we move inferiorly, we can see the thyroid gland, which is a butterfly-shaped gland in the neck. And it consists of two lobes connected by an isthmus. On the posterior or dorsal aspect of the thyroid gland are the parathyroid glands. Below the thyroid glands is the thymus, and the thymus helps to control the development of T lymphocytes, which are active in our immune system. As we travel inferiorly, we have the adrenal glands or suprarenal glands that are present on top of or near to the kidneys. Here we have the pancreas, which is an important part of our digestive system in addition to being an endocrine gland. And then finally, we have the gonads, the ovary in the female, the testes in the male. Here we have various endocrine glands. First, we have the pituitary gland, which hangs off of the hypothalamus by a stalk called the infundibulum, which is indicated here. Second, we have the butterfly-shaped thyroid gland, which is found just below the larynx, and it is made up of two lobes connected by an isthmus. Third, we have the adrenal gland, which sits atop the kidney. Next, we have the testes. Here we have the pancreas. This represents the parathyroid glands, which are 4 to 8 small glands located on the dorsal or posterior aspect of the thyroid gland. And then finally, we have the ovary. The first gland that we are going to discuss in detail is the pituitary gland, which is also known as the hypophysis. It is attached to the hypothalamus by a stalk or peduncle called the infundibulum. The pituitary gland can be divided into two parts: the anterior pituitary or adenohypophysis, and the posterior pituitary or neurohypophysis. The divisions of the pituitary gland have these specific names based on their embryonic origin. Adeno means gland, so the anterior pituitary consists of glandular tissue, while the posterior pituitary consists of nervous tissue. And these names also indicate how these specific parts of the pituitary gland are stimulated. This diagram shows us the different divisions of the pituitary gland very clearly. Superiorly, we have the hypothalamus, and from the hypothalamus, we can see neurons running down into the posterior pituitary. As we said before, the posterior pituitary is also known as the neurohypophysis, and this means that it is from nervous tissue, or it is derived from nervous tissue. When the posterior pituitary is stimulated to release its hormones, it is done so by neural stimulation from the hypothalamus. The anterior pituitary, by deference, is stimulated to release its hormones by hormonal influence from the hypothalamus. Here we see an important system called the hypophyseal portal system. This system is a venous system that transports, inhibiting, and releasing hormones from the hypothalamus down into the anterior pituitary, and by stimulating the anterior pituitary in this way, it causes the secretion of 6 different hormones. Note that the hypophyseal portal system is a venous system, which means that it is under low flow. This is an unusual way for hormones to be transported, as most hormones will be transported in an arterial system. Now we'll talk about the different divisions of the pituitary gland, and we'll talk about the hormones that are released from each division. The anterior pituitary is responsible for producing 6 hormones. 4 of these hormones are called tropic hormones. A tropic hormone is a hormone that can stimulate another endocrine gland to produce and release its hormones. The 4 tropic hormones are follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, luteinizing hormone, LH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, thyroid stimulating hormone. Of these tropic hormones, 2 are referred to as gonadotropins. That means that they directly stimulate the ovary and testes. The gonadotropins are follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. In addition to the 4 tropic hormones produced by the anterior pituitary also produces and secretes growth hormone and prolactin. We'll talk about how each pituitary hormone acts on its target tissue. We also need to remember that anterior pituitary hormones are stimulated to be released by either inhibitory hormones from the hypothalamus or releasing hormones from the hypothalamus. This diagram shows us how the hypothalamus induces the anterior pituitary to release its hormones. When specific nuclei or neurons within the hypothalamus are stimulated, these neurons will either secrete releasing hormones or inhibitory hormones, and these hormones will travel via the hypophyseal portal system to the anterior pituitary. These releasing or stimulating hormones will in turn cause the anterior pituitary to secrete one of its 6 hormones. Table 27.1a from our lab manual outlines all of the anterior pituitary hormones, the stimulus for release, their target tissue or target receptor, and the effect that this hormone will have at its target. First, let's discuss the 4 tropic hormones that are released by the anterior pituitary. The first hormone is thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. And as its name suggests, it has a target receptor on the thyroid gland, or within the thyroid gland, because this one acts like a steroid hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone is triggered to be released by a hypothalamic hormone known as thyrotropin releasing hormone. When thyroid stimulating hormone binds to receptors within the thyroid gland, it stimulates the secretion of the thyroid hormones T3 and T4. T3 and T4 are responsible for controlling our metabolic rate. The next hormone released by the anterior pituitary is follicle-stimulating hormone. Follicle-stimulating hormone works directly on the ovaries and testes, and in the female, FSH will stimulate ovarian follicle maturation and estrogen production. In the male, it will stimulate sperm production. Luteinizing hormone will also work on the ovaries and testes, and in the female, it triggers ovulation and stimulates ovarian production of estrogen and progesterone. In the male, LH stimulates testosterone production. Both FSH and LH are stimulated by the hormone gonadotropin releasing hormone, which is produced by the hypothalamus. The final tropic hormone of the anterior pituitary is adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. ACTH works on the outermost portion of the adrenal gland, which is known as the adrenal cortex. When it stimulates the adrenal cortex, it stimulates it to release mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and androgens. ACTH is stimulated to be released by corticotropin releasing hormone, which is produced by the hypothalamus. The other non-tropic hormones produced by the anterior pituitary are growth hormone and prolactin. Growth hormone works directly on the liver, muscle, and bone, and in doing so, it stimulates body growth and protein synthesis and helps to mobilize fat from storage. It is stimulated to be released by the hypothalamic hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone. Prolactin stimulates the mammary gland to produce milk. Its release is inhibited by the hypothalamic hormone, prolactin inhibiting hormone. Non-pregnant females and males regularly produce prolactin inhibiting hormone and therefore do not normally produce milk. When it is time for a woman to produce milk in order to feed her young, the levels of prolactin inhibiting hormone from the hypothalamus will decrease to enable milk production. The posterior pituitary acts as a storage area for hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus. The two hormones that are stored in the posterior pituitary are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Oxytocin works directly on the smooth muscle of the uterus and causes uterine contraction by a positive feedback mechanism. Antidiuretic hormone works on the kidney and it enables us to retain water. Disease conditions can result from oversecretion or undersecretion of any of our hormones. And as we discuss, we will look at specific incidences or specific diseases in which we have hyposecretion or undersecretion and hyper or oversecretion of the hormones. The pituitary hormone, posterior pituitary hormone, ADH, if it is undersecreted, it results in a disease condition called diabetes insipidus. This is completely different than diabetes mellitus, in which there is inappropriate glucose regulation. Diabetes insipidus receives its name from the fact that it shares a common feature with diabetes mellitus, and that is these people are water hungry. They will want to continually drink water because antidiuretic hormone does not give the signal to the kidney that it should retain water. So therefore, this person will drink water in order to make up for the fact that the kidney is not retaining water appropriately. If we have oversecretion or hypersecretion of antidiuretic hormone, it results in a disease condition called syndrome of inappropriate ADH or SIADH. In this condition, the patient unintentionally retains excess water, and that is due to the excess stimulation of kidney tubules by the excess antidiuretic hormone. It is important to note that hormones from the posterior pituitary were created in the hypothalamus and transferred to the posterior pituitary for storage. It is also important to remember that the hormones of the posterior pituitary are signaled to release their stored hormones by nervous impulse. This illustration shows us how hormones are prepared by the hypothalamus and then transferred to the posterior pituitary. The paraventricular nucleus in the hypothalamus produces the hormone oxytocin, and that oxytocin is transported to the posterior pituitary for storage until it is time for it to be released. This hormone travels by the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract. Antidiuretic hormone is produced by the supraoptic nucleus of the hypothalamus. And again, this hormone is transported by the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract down to the posterior pituitary. Both oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone are stored in axon terminals within the posterior pituitary, and when it is time for them to be released, there will be direct nervous stimulation from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary. Let's take a detailed look at the hormones that are stored within the posterior pituitary. First, we have oxytocin, also known as vasopressin, that is produced in the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus. And when it is induced to be secreted, it works directly on the uterus and mammary gland. In the uterus, it causes powerful uterine contractions needed for labor and delivery. And in the mammary gland, it causes the initial ejection of milk, which is known as milk letdown. Again, note that nervous impulses from the hypothalamus will travel to the posterior pituitary in order to cause the release of this hormone. Additionally, when the smooth muscle of the uterus and cervix contract and expand, it will additionally send a signal to the hypothalamus, which will in turn stimulate the posterior pituitary to release this hormone. Antidiuretic hormone is produced by the supraoptic nucleus of the hypothalamus, and it works directly on the kidneys. When it reaches the kidneys, it stimulates the kidneys to reabsorb more water, and in doing so, it decreases urine output. Again, nervous impulses from the hypothalamus trigger the release of antidiuretic hormone from the posterior pituitary. Now, let's take a look at the gross anatomy of the pituitary gland. This diagram shows us the pituitary gland in addition to other endocrine glands. Can you figure out which part indicates the anterior versus posterior pituitary? This portion shown in green indicates that this is our anterior pituitary, while the portion in yellow indicates that this is the posterior pituitary. And we know this because we can see neurons traveling from the hypothalamus down into the posterior pituitary. The stalk that connects the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland is known as the infundibulum. Can you tell which one of these structures represents the pituitary gland? Let's orient ourselves. So this is the cerebral hemisphere. This is the cerebellum, and this is the brainstem. So this tells us that this is the anterior portion of the brain, whereas this is the posterior portion of the brain. From ANP1, we will remember that the pituitary gland sits in the sella turcica, which is a portion of the sphenoid bone, and it is at this location that the optic chiasm crosses. So in this illustration, or in this model, number 3 represents the location of the pituitary gland. This is another model showing us the location of the pituitary gland. Again, this is the cerebral hemisphere, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. So this structure, number 3, indicates the location of the pituitary gland. Do you know what number 1 and number 2 are? Number 1 represents the hypothalamus. And number 2 represents the pineal gland, which we will discuss shortly. This top diagram also represents the pituitary gland. And now we need to figure out which portion is anterior versus posterior pituitary. Figure number 1, or portion number 1, indicates the stalk that connects the pituitary gland with the hypothalamus. So number 1 is the infundibulum. Number 2 shows us a section of the pituitary gland, and this is the anterior pituitary gland. We know this because we can see lots of cells, and we tend to see lots of cells that are mitotically active in glandular tissue. 4, by this numbering system, represents the posterior pituitary. And we know this because these are nerve tracts. So 1 is the infundibulum, 2 represents the entire pituitary gland, or hypophysis. So another name for the pituitary is the hypophysis. 3 shows us the adenohypophysis, the glandular portion or anterior pituitary. And then 4 represents the neurohypophysis or the posterior pituitary. This model also shows us the location of the pituitary gland. So imagine if we've taken a brain out of the skull and we turned it upside down. So now we're looking at the inferior portion of the brain. So let's orient ourselves. These are our cerebral hemispheres. This is the cerebellum, and this is the brainstem. Here we see the olfactory bulbs that look like 2 antennae. And then in the region of the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone, we would find our pituitary gland. This model also shows us the location of 3 important glands in our brain. Number 1 represents the pineal gland. Number 2, the hypothalamus. And 3 indicates the pituitary gland. 4 is a butterfly-shaped gland that's found just below the larynx, and this gland is the thyroid gland, which we will discuss momentarily. Now let's take a look at the histology of the pituitary gland. If we were to take sections of the anterior and posterior pituitary, this is what we would see. The anterior pituitary contains 3 different cell types: acidophils, basophils, and chromophobes. These 3 cell types represent different functions within the anterior pituitary. The acidophils produce the non-tropic hormones that are produced by the anterior pituitary. Can you name those non-tropic hormones? They are growth hormone and prolactin. The basophils produce the tropic hormones that are produced by the anterior pituitary. The gonadotropins, TSH and LH, and the additional tropic hormones, ACTH and TSH. The chromophobes are the 3rd group of cells. They are not directly involved in hormone production. They are supportive cells, and they are called chromophobes because they do not take stain well. So the term chromophobe means afraid of color. If we examine the posterior pituitary, we see that we have cell types called pituocytes, and we have lots of nerve fibers running through the posterior pituitary. This photomicrograph also shows us a distinct difference between the anterior and posterior pituitary. Here we can see that the anterior pituitary is glandular in nature, and we see that it has lots of dividing cells, whereas the posterior pituitary has less cell bodies and it has a variety of neurons running throughout. This again is another cross-section of the pituitary gland. Can you determine which portion represents anterior and which portion represents posterior pituitary? Did you guess it right? One represents posterior pituitary, and we see that it is nervous tissue in nature, and 2 represents anterior pituitary, and we can see that this is glandular in nature. This represents a segment of the pituitary gland as well. What do you think it is? That's right, it's the anterior pituitary. And this represents the posterior pituitary. And here we can also see fenestrated capillaries, or capillaries with holes in them. All right, this photomicrograph shows us yet another image of the histology of the anterior versus posterior pituitary. Can you tell which area represents anterior and which area represents posterior? That's right. 1 is anterior pituitary, while 2 represents posterior pituitary. Next, we will discuss the pineal gland. The pineal gland is a cone-shaped gland that is found in the roof of the third ventricle. Its role is to secrete melatonin, and melatonin is responsible for regulating our sleep-wake cycle or our circadian rhythm. This diagram shows us 3 important glands that are present in the brain. Number 1 shows us the location of the pineal gland, 2, the hypothalamus, and 3, the pituitary gland. This also shows us the location of the same 3 glands. So in this image, 2 represents the pineal gland present in the third ventricle. Next, we're going to examine the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is a butterfly-shaped organ that is present in the cervical region, and it is located just inferior to the larynx. It consists of 2 lobes connected by an isthmus. The thyroid gland secretes 3 hormones. The first 2 hormones are called thyroxine, or T4, and triiodothyronine, T3. These hormones are responsible for regulating our metabolism. When we speak of the metabolic rate, that means the amount of energy we require to carry out our autonomic functions such as breathing, maintaining our blood pressure, and so forth. The third hormone that is secreted by the thyroid gland is known as calcitonin. And calcitonin helps to decrease blood calcium levels when needed. This table gives us a good overview of the thyroid hormones, their target cells, stimulus for release, and the effect that they have on their targets. So T4 thyroxine and T3 triiodothyronine are stimulated to be released by thyroid stimulating hormone, which is produced by the anterior pituitary. This hormone, or these hormones, I should say, work on most of the cells of our body, and when they bind to receptors on the cells, they help to increase basal metabolic rate. They also help to regulate tissue growth and development. Thyroxine and triiodothyronine, T4 and T3, are secreted by follicular cells in the thyroid gland. The third hormone from the thyroid gland is called calcitonin, and this is secreted by the parafollicular or C cells of the thyroid gland. Calcitonin works by working directly on bone, and when it works directly on bone, it stimulates osteoclast activity. Osteoclasts break bone down, and in doing so, they will release calcium into the bloodstream. Next, we'll discuss the parathyroid glands. The parathyroid glands are located on the dorsal or posterior aspect of the thyroid gland. And typically there are between 4 to 8 glands per person. We usually have 2 glands located superiorly and 2 glands inferiorly on the dorsal aspect of the thyroid lobes. The parathyroid glands secrete parathyroid hormone, and parathyroid hormone helps to regulate calcium balance. If there are low levels of blood calcium circulating, then the parathyroid glands release parathyroid hormone, abbreviated PTH. PTH stimulates osteoclasts in the bone to break bone down, and in doing so, it helps to increase calcium levels in the blood. If we have hyposecretion of parathyroid gland, that means that when blood calcium levels decline, we will not stimulate osteoclast to remove calcium from bone, and levels of calcium in the blood will remain low. When we have low calcium levels, it affects things such as contraction of skeletal muscle. If a person has hypocalcemia as a result of hypoparathyroidism, we find that although the nerve will stimulate the muscle to contract, the muscle is unable to because calcium is not available. As a result, this leads to tetany, which is continual stimulation of the muscle without contraction, and that can eventually lead to failure of respiratory muscles to contract, and this will lead to death. If we have hyperparathyroidism, meaning an oversecretion of parathyroid hormone, that means that the osteoclasts are stimulated to break bone down more than it should be. This causes increased levels of calcium in the blood and decreased levels of calcium in the bone. We know that calcium is what makes our bone hard, So a decreased level of calcium in the bone means that the bone will become weak and softened, and that means that this person can easily fracture bones or may have bone deformities as a result of decreased calcium in the bone. This table shows us how parathyroid hormone is stimulated to be released, its target tissues, and the effect of parathyroid hormone on the target tissue. So again, parathyroid hormone is stimulated to be released by low blood calcium levels. It will work directly on the bones and kidney. In the bone, it will stimulate osteoclasts to break bone down and therefore release calcium into the blood. In the kidney, it works to help us resorb calcium and also helps us to convert vitamin D to its active form. When vitamin D is present in its active form, that in turn can help us to absorb more calcium from our intestines. So parathyroid hormone functions to increase blood calcium levels. Now let's take a look at the gross anatomy and the histology of the thyroid and parathyroid glands. So this diagram shows us the exact location of the thyroid gland. So it is located in the cervical neck region, just below the larynx. Here on our model, we can see that the thyroid gland is located just below our larynx, and we see two laterally placed lobes connected by an isthmus. On the posterior of the thyroid gland, we have the parathyroid glands. In this case, we have two superiorly and two inferiorly on the lateral lobes. Can you tell what this structure is? That's right, it's the thyroid gland. And this is showing us the dorsal aspect. So this is one lobe, this is a second lobe. They are connected by an isthmus, and this is the dorsal aspect, so we see two pairs of parathyroid glands. The lower model shows us the parts of the adrenal gland, and we will look at the adrenal gland shortly. This model shows us the location of the thyroid gland and parathyroid glands in the neck region. So above here, we would have our larynx. This is our sternocleidomastoid muscle. And we see the ringed cartilage of our trachea here. And here we can see one lobe of the thyroid gland, and we can see two parathyroid glands attached to the dorsal aspect of that thyroid gland. This is yet another model, and this is the model that we have in lab, and this shows us the anterior aspect of the thyroid gland. And you can orient yourself because here is the cricoid cartilage of the larynx. This is the sternocleidomastoid muscle, and then you see here the ringed tracheal cartilage in blue. Now we'll look at the histology of the thyroid and parathyroid glands. So when we consider the thyroid gland, we need to know that when the thyroid hormones T3 and T4 are produced, they are secreted and they stay inside the center of the follicle, and the center of the follicle contains colloid. Within the colloid, we have T3 and T4, and they are bound to a protein known as thyroglobulin. Follicular cells that are found on the borders of our follicle are responsible for producing T3 and T4. Parafollicular cells, which are located next to or adjacent to the follicular cells, are responsible for secreting the hormone calcitonin. This shows us another histological image featuring the thyroid and parathyroid gland. So one is the thyroid gland, whereas two is the parathyroid gland. So it looks a little bit like a tongue with an additional structure, a tumor or a stone attached here. Okay, so we need to know the distinction between the thyroid gland and the parathyroid gland histologically. This is yet another example of the thyroid gland. What would we call the interior of this follicle? What is it filled with? It is filled with colloid. What do we call the cells that are responsible for producing T3 and T4? Those are the follicular cells. We have one additional cell type present within the thyroid, and those are the parafollicular cells, which are next to follicular cells, and these cells will secrete calcitonin, which helps to regulate calcium levels in the blood. This is yet another histological sample featuring the thyroid gland. And we can see our colloid-filled follicles. We can see our parathyroid gland here. And we see the lining follicular cells that will secrete T3 and T4. Thyroid gland again, and yet another closer or more magnified version. Here we see our parathyroid gland, thyroid gland, colloid-filled follicles, parafollicular cells, and follicular cells. This is yet another histological snapshot of the thyroid gland. The parathyroid gland is shown histologically here, and it contains two cell types. The cell type that we are most concerned with are the parathyroid cells, and the parathyroid cells are responsible for secreting parathyroid hormone. This is just another histological section showing the parathyroid and thyroid glands. Here we have oxyphil cells, and oxyphil cells in the parathyroid gland are just another type of supportive cell within the parathyroid gland, and oxyphil cells are found in other organs as well. They have no known function here in the parathyroid gland. And this is yet another section showing us the difference between the histology of the thyroid and parathyroid glands. So again, the most important details that we need to know are the parathyroid cells that secrete PTH. Oxyphil cells have no known function in humans, and we need to realize that this is parathyroid gland versus thyroid gland, where we can see colloid-filled follicles lined by follicular cells. Follicular cells secrete T3 and T4, and adjacent to the follicular cells are parafollicular or C cells, and they secrete calcitonin. So C for calcitonin. The next gland that we need to examine is called the thymus. And the thymus is the gland that is located in the mediastinum. So it's located in the upper thorax, between the sternum and the heart. And what we should know is that when we are born, our thymus is large and it decreases in size as we get older. The thymus produces 3 hormones, and the most important one that we need to remember is thymosins. And these thymosins help T lymphocytes from our immune system to become mature. So T lymphocytes are an important part of our immune response. They help to defend the body in our immune reactions. And this is something that we will study in detail when we cover the immune system. So this diagram shows us where the thymus is located. And we see that it's located in the upper thoracic area. And by the time we reach our late teens, the thymus has decreased significantly in size from when we were born. The adrenal glands are next, and these are a pair of glands that sit on top of or near to the kidney. Adrenal glands are also known as the suprarenal glands, and this is because supra means above and renal refers to the kidney. The adrenal glands can be divided into 2 separate portions or 2 separate divisions: the outer adrenal cortex and the inner adrenal medulla, and they have different developmental origins. So we'll talk about the adrenal medulla first. And we should know that the adrenal medulla arises from nervous tissue. And because it arises from nervous tissue, it is triggered to release its hormones by direct nervous stimulation, and it is stimulated to produce the catecholamines epinephrine and norepinephrine when our sympathetic system is active. So when we are carrying out the fight or flight response, the adrenal medulla is triggered to release epinephrine and norepinephrine, and collectively they are called the catecholamines. The adrenal cortex comes from glandular origins. So it is different in embryonic origin than the adrenal medulla. The adrenal cortex can be divided up into 3 zones, and each zone makes a different type of corticosteroid hormone. The first zone is called zona glomerulosa, and it produces mineralocorticoids. The second zone is called zona fasciculata, and it produces glucocorticoids. And the third zone is called zona reticularis, and it produces gonadocorticoids. When we look at the histology of the adrenal cortex, we'll review the types of hormones each zone produces, and a good mnemonic for helping us to remember the zones and what they produce. So here on our model, we see that this third model in the upper row shows us a kidney, and sitting atop a kidney is the adrenal gland. Okay. So the adrenal gland is also called the suprarenal gland because it sits on top of or near to the kidney. Here we see the paired adrenal glands sitting atop the kidney in our torso model. This model shows us the different divisions of the adrenal gland. So this lower model shows us the adrenal gland, and it can be divided into two parts: the outer adrenal cortex and then the inner adrenal medulla. The adrenal cortex is of glandular origin. The adrenal medulla is from nervous system or nervous tissue origin. This is just another torso model indicating the location of our adrenal glands. In this picture, we also see another gland that we will talk about momentarily, and this is our pancreas. This is what the adrenal gland looks like histologically. So it's important for us to review the different zones that make up our adrenal cortex. And at the lowermost portion here, we have the adrenal medulla. The adrenal gland is an encapsulated gland. So here at the uppermost portion, we see the surrounding capsule. And then we see three distinct zones present in the adrenal cortex. These zones are zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and zona reticularis. Zona glomerulosa helps us to regulate salt. Here we're talking about sodium levels in the blood. And we regulate sodium levels in the blood with the hormone aldosterone. Aldosterone is classified as a mineralocorticoid. Therefore, we know that zona glomerulosa is responsible for producing mineralocorticoids like aldosterone. Zona fasciculata helps us to regulate stress. It produces glucocorticoids. And the most common glucocorticoid zona fasciculata will produce is known as cortisol. So when we are stressed, we produce elevated levels of cortisol in order for us to handle that stress. Zona reticularis is the innermost zone of the adrenal cortex, and this zone produces sex hormones, specifically androgens like testosterone. So a mnemonic to remember the adrenal cortex and what it produces is GFR. GFR stands for glomerular filtration rate. And this is a value that we will evaluate when we look at the urinary system. The adrenal gland has nothing to do with how fast fluid is filtered through the glomerulus. However, it does provide us with a good and easy mnemonic to remember. So to remember the zones, we use the mnemonic GFR, and that stands for zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, zona reticularis. Each zone is responsible for producing a different type of hormone. So zona glomerulosa produces mineralocorticoids. And our best example is aldosterone, which helps regulate salt. Fasciculata produces glucocorticoids, which helps us to regulate stress. And our best example here is cortisol. Reticularis produces the sex hormone, testosterone. So our mnemonic for the adrenal cortex is GFR to remember the layers. And then we need to remember the mnemonic that tells us salt, stress, and sex. And that reminds us that zona glomerulosa makes Aldosterone, which regulates salt. Fasciculata produces cortisol, which helps to regulate stress. And reticularis produces our sex hormone, testosterone. Finally, in this photomicrograph, we see the adrenal medulla, and the adrenal medulla has a different embryonic derivative than the adrenal cortex. It has a nervous system derivative, and it produces the catecholamines, epinephrine, and norepinephrine by direct nervous stimulation. So this is another histological view of the adrenal gland. As we said, it is an encapsulated organ, so it is surrounded by a capsule. And then internally we have the outermost cortex, which is in turn divided into 3 layers. Remember GFR, and this is of glandular origin. And internally we have the adrenal medulla, and this is a nervous system or nervous tissue derivative. And this produces catecholamines, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. Here again, we're able to see the histological appearance of the adrenal gland. We have a capsule, and then we have the outermost layer, which is the cortex, and then the innermost layer, which is the medulla. We really should say adrenal cortex and adrenal medulla to distinguish it from other organs that bear the same type of name. This is yet another section that shows us the adrenal gland, and we can see that this area represents the adrenal cortex, and this represents the adrenal medulla. And this is just yet another photomicrograph showing us the different regions of the adrenal gland. So this table is directly from our lab manual, and it is a good breakdown of each hormone that is produced by the different portions of the adrenal gland. It tells us what stimulates the release of that hormone, where that hormone acts, and what the effect of that hormone is. So we've gone over that while we looked at the histology, but it would be a good idea for you to review this table so that you have a good idea of what stimulates each one of these zones of the adrenal cortex to produce its hormone, and what stimulates the adrenal medulla to produce its hormones. Our next organ is the pancreas, and the pancreas is an important digestive organ. So as an exocrine gland, it produces a lot of pancreatic enzymes. As an endocrine gland, it produces 2 very important antagonistic hormones that enable us to control or regulate our blood glucose. The pancreas is located near to the stomach and a part of our small intestine called the duodenum or duodenum. What we need to know is that as an endocrine gland, the beta cells of the islets of Langerhans produce insulin in response to increased blood sugar levels. So insulin works to decrease our blood sugar levels, and it does so by pushing blood glucose into cells for storage as glycogen. Glucagon is produced by the alpha cells in the islets of the pancreas, and this hormone, is an antagonist to insulin, so it works opposite to insulin. Glucagon helps us to increase blood sugar levels if they are low, and it does so by taking glycogen, our stored form of glucose, bringing it out of the cell, and enabling it to go through a process known as gluconeogenesis, which will break glycogen down into usable glucose. It is important for our hormones to be present within specific ranges, and if they are present outside of those specific ranges, it can cause a disease condition. So if we have insulin present in less than sufficient quantities, it will result in the disease diabetes mellitus or diabetes mellitus. So hyposecretion of insulin results in diabetes mellitus or diabetes mellitus. And in that instance, a person who suffers from this type of diabetes will be unable to lower their blood glucose levels, either because they have no insulin, as we see in type 1 diabetes, or they have less insulin production than normal. And that is typically what we see in type 2 diabetes. If we have oversecretion of insulin, that means that circulating blood sugar will be pushed into the cells for storage inappropriately. So that means we will not have sufficient blood glucose to fuel our cells. So a decreased level of blood glucose is referred to as hypoglycemia. That means we have less circulating blood glucose than normal, and this will lead to the person becoming dizzy and passing out. They will faint because they do not have enough energy to sustain cellular activity. Glucagon, we said, is the antagonist of insulin. It works opposite to insulin, meaning that it takes stored glucose in the form of glycogen out of cells of the liver, and it puts it through a process that enables us to turn it into usable glucose. This slide shows us the stimulus for release for both insulin and glucagon, their target cells, and the effect that they will have on those target cells. So increased blood glucose levels and parasympathetic nervous stimulation stimulate the beta cells in the islets of Langerhans to secrete insulin, whereas decreased blood glucose levels and sympathetic nervous system stimulation trigger the alpha cells to release glucagon. Insulin works on almost all of our bodily cells, whereas glucagon works primarily on the liver and adipose, and this is where glycogen, the storage form of glucose, is typically found. When we secrete insulin, insulin acts to push glucose that's circulating in the blood into body cells, and in doing so, it stimulates the formation of glycogen, fat, and it can also stimulate protein synthesis. Glucagon works opposite to insulin, meaning that it will bring glycogen out of storage and have it broken down to glucose. So again, to recap, it's important for us to know that alpha cells in the islets of Langerhans secrete glucagon, whereas beta cells in the islets secrete insulin. And we will take a look at these cells when we look at the histology of the pancreas. Before we look at the histology, we'll take a look at the gross anatomy. And this diagram shows us where the pancreas is located. So it's located in the abdominal region, and it is most closely related to our stomach and a portion of our small intestine known as the duodenum or duodenum. This shows us what the pancreas looks like on our model. And here again, we can see the pancreas, and we can see it as it lies in the abdominal cavity. And on this model, the stomach has been removed, but we can see here that it is closely related to our small intestine. So this is the histology of the pancreas. And what we want to know is that we have two main cell types present. This region within the tissue is called an islet because it looked like a small island to the person who first described it. And here we see our larger, vibrantly stained alpha cells, and these cells produce glucagon, whereas we have our smaller, less vibrantly stained beta cells, and they produce insulin. The other cell types that are present are supportive cells. Okay, this again shows us the histology of our pancreas. So here we see our pancreatic islets. These ducts are used for the exocrine pancreas, not the endocrine pancreas, but we just want to be aware that these are pancreatic islets where insulin and glucagon are produced. This is another histological photomicrograph showing us what the pancreas looks like, and we can distinguish our alpha cells, beta cells, and our pancreatic acinar or supportive cells. And now we finally move on to the gonads. So the gonads consist of our ovaries and testes, ovary in the female, testes in the male. And these are responsible for producing our gametes, the egg in the female, sperm in the male. So we'll talk about the ovaries first. And the ovaries are located in the pelvic cavity of the female. And as an endocrine gland, they produce two hormones, estrogen and progesterone. As an exocrine gland, they produce ova, or they will produce eggs. And they start to function during puberty. The testes is located in the scrotum outside of the pelvic cavity, and it also has endocrine and exocrine function. So as an endocrine gland, it produces the hormone testosterone. As an exocrine gland, it produces sperm, and these functions also start to become active at puberty. So here we see the stimulus for release for our hormones from the ovary and testes. And we see that they are stimulated to be released by the gonadotropic hormones, LH and FSH. And these hormones are trophic hormones from the anterior pituitary. So when the ovary is stimulated by LH and FSH, it helps us to have secondary sexual characteristics like the development of breast take place. It helps in the regulation of the menstrual cycle. It helps to promote breast development. And we will see that it will help to maintain pregnancy later on. When we have stimulation of the testes by LH and FSH, it enables us to produce testosterone. And in the male, it helps with development of secondary sexual characteristics like the deepening of voice at puberty, sperm production, and it helps to regulate or increase sex drive. Okay, so on our model here, we have the ovary shown here, connected to our fallopian tube and uterus. And here we have the testes. And they're collectively known as the gonads, so they are stimulated to produce their hormones by gonadotropic hormones from the anterior pituitary. So here's the testes on our model. And here again we see our testes located outside of the abdominal cavity. And this model shows us the uterus. So this is like a mid-sagittal view. And here in yellow we see the ovary, and this would be our fallopian tube. in red. And here again, we can see examples of our ovary on our models. So finally, we need to discuss what type of endocrine disorders can occur if we have an imbalance in the secretion of endocrine hormones. So we'll look at individual hormones and what can happen if we have hyposecretion or less secretion of the hormone than normal, and what happens if we have hypersecretion, more secretion of the hormone than normal. So growth hormone, we know, is secreted by the pituitary gland, the anterior pituitary, and if we have insufficient secretion of growth hormone in childhood, it results in pituitary dwarfism, which means that this child will have short stature. They will not reach their full height potential. So growth hormone again stimulates the epiphyseal plate, and it stimulates it in order to allow long bones to grow. Lack of growth hormone will result in no stimulation to this epiphyseal plate or little stimulation to the epiphyseal plate, and that will result in short stature. If we have undersecretion of growth hormone in an adult, it does not typically cause any issues. If we have excess secretion or hypersecretion of growth hormone, it can result in one of two diseases, and it depends on whether or not the hypersecretion occurs before or after epiphyseal plate closure. So in children, if we have an excess of growth hormone, it results in the disease condition gigantism. So people with gigantism are abnormally tall, and when we think about it, they have to circulate a larger blood volume over a larger area than a person of average height. People with gigantism can grow up to 8 feet tall. And unfortunately, they typically die at a young age due to just the stress on their cardiovascular system that occurs as a result of gigantism. If a person has an excess production of growth hormone after epiphyseal plate closure, it results in acromegaly. And in acromegaly, we have thickening of the bone, specifically in the face, hands, and feet. So people with acromegaly will have a very strong or very coarse appearance, especially in the region of their jaw. Next, we'll look at antidiuretic hormone, which we know is produced by the hypothalamus, but stored in the posterior pituitary. And if we have insufficient or hyposecretion of antidiuretic hormone, it results in diabetes insipidus, and it is called diabetes insipidus because it shares a characteristic of people with diabetes mellitus or diabetes mellitus. People with diabetes insipidus have a thirst for water. So if they do not have antidiuretic hormone, the kidney is not triggered to preserve or resorb water as it should. Therefore, this person is going to have excess urine output, and also in order to replace the fluid that's lost, they will want to drink a lot. So they have a thirst for water, and they have those commonalities of symptoms with diabetes mellitus. If we have an excess production of antidiuretic hormone, it results in the condition called syndrome of inappropriate ADH. Therefore, the kidney tubules are overstimulated to resorb water, and this person will retain fluid. Thyroid hormone, we know, regulates our metabolism. if we have hyposecretion of thyroid hormone or hypothyroidism, in a child, it results in cretinism. And cretinism is what occurs when we do not have thyroid hormone. We have developmental delays, we have neurologic delays, and a person who does not have sufficient thyroid hormone in childhood will have mental retardation. They tend to have a large tongue, and they tend to have very short stature because growth hormone and thyroid hormone work in conjunction in order to facilitate normal growth and development. If we have an overproduction of thyroid hormone, it results in hyperthyroidism, and one common cause of hyperthyroidism is called Graves' disease. Graves' disease is an autoimmune disease in which we have artificially increased thyroid hormone circulating, and as a result, it affects metabolism and it affects muscle contraction. So we're going to see that this person has increased metabolism, meaning they can eat just as much as they normally would, but they're losing weight. It will affect the smooth muscle of the person's digestive tract, and they will have diarrhea in some cases. It will cause the heartbeat to be irregular and faster than it normally should. It can affect the nervous system and cause this person to feel shaky or jittery. And one unusual effect that thyroid hormone can have is that it causes increased size of extraorbital fat. So the fat surrounding the eyeballs tends to enlarge, and when it enlarges, it causes the eyes to protrude. We call this exophthalmos. If we have a deficiency of thyroid hormone in an adult, it results in what we call myxedema. So it has the opposite effect of what the thyroid hormone usually does. So the person's metabolic rate will be decreased. This person will have weight gain. They can have constipation. They can feel tired and sluggish. And they can have dry skin, dry hair. And this is all as a result of insufficiency of thyroid hormone. We discussed parathyroid hormone deficiency and excesses previously, but we just want to remember that low parathyroid hormone or parathyroidism, hypoparathyroidism, causes stimulation of skeletal muscle without the ability to contract, and we call that tetany. And it can result in failure of respiratory muscles to contract and eventually death. Hyperparathyroidism affects the removal of calcium from the bone, so this person can fracture easily, and they can also form kidney stones, okay, which are extremely painful and difficult to pass through the urinary system. Finally, if we have a deficiency of insulin, it results in the disease diabetes mellitus or diabetes mellitus, and we are unable to move glucose into the cells as we normally would. This results in a higher circulating level of glucose in the blood, and glucose will eventually cause damage to the nephrons in our kidney, and glucose will be found in our urine. Okay, so this glycosuria is a sign of diabetes. We should not normally find glucose in the urine. However, if we have excess glucose, it can cause damage to the nephrons of the kidney, and this glucose can be released into the urine. If we have too much insulin, that means that it is going to take glucose from our blood and push it into cells for storage. So if a person has insufficient levels of glucose, they're going to feel weak and they may pass out, and that is simply because they do not have sufficient energy to fuel their cells. Now finally, for your exam, it is important that you have a look at the PowerPoints on the endocrine system that are in Canvas. This is an amalgamation of those PowerPoints. But it is important to have a look at the gross anatomical structures. It's important to review the histological structures, and it is important to learn or know about any diseases that are listed on your study guide. I hope that this has been a thorough review of the endocrine system for you. Please reach out with any questions that you may have.